All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because you're the kind of person who wants to like really get a grasp on some of the big issues that are out there. You want to understand things in depth, but you don't necessarily have time to read like a whole stack of books, right?
Yeah.
So we do the reading for you, and today we are diving into a really significant topic. I mean, this is one that has been going on for a while. We're looking at the early history of Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, it's one of those issues where, like, everyone has heard about it, everyone probably has some opinions on it, but, like, how much do we actually know about, like, how we got here?
Exactly.
Like, what are the sort of, like, root causes of this thing that's been, going on for so long and, causing so much pain and, controversy, and, like, how can we understand it better?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're going to do today is we're going to look at the historical context. We really need to understand the history that led up to, the situation as we know it today. And that means going back and looking at, centuries of anti-Jewish violence in Europe and Russia in particular, and how that kind of created the conditions for this movement to emerge.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at a whole variety of sources to do that. I mean, we've got, historical accounts, we've got like primary sources, letters, diaries, all sorts of stuff. We're going to be pulling from like political writings and like even, some personal stories,
Right. Yeah.
just to try to get a sense of like what was going on, what were people thinking, how did they end up making the decisions they made?
Right. And I think that's the mission here today is like extracting the most important insights from all this material and really revealing maybe some things that people aren't aware of.
Right.
Surprising facts, but also like the motivations, behind these key developments. So, okay, if we were going to start, unpacking this, let's start with this history of anti-Jewish violence in Europe and Russia.
Yeah.
And one thing that is really striking when you look at the sources is just how persistent this violence was.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just like a few isolated incidents. This was a pattern of like recurring violence that lasted for centuries.
Yeah, we kind of start the whole thing with this scene of like a Jewish family in the late 1800s,
Right.
like huddled in their home, terrified because there's a mob outside. And that image is so powerful because it wasn't just, one time. That was like a reality for countless Jewish families, generation after generation, this constant threat of violence just hanging over them. It's hard to even imagine like living with that kind of fear all the time, right?
Right. And it wasn't just about the physical attacks either, right? I mean, it creates this atmosphere of like insecurity, right? It erodes this sense of belonging.
Yeah, exactly. And we're not talking about like random acts of violence here either. I mean, a lot of what we're looking at is like organized persecution.
Yeah.
Pogroms, especially in the Russian Empire. I mean, these were often literally like state-sanctioned, mobs attacking Jewish communities, like just destroying property and killing people. And I was reading this one source that said there were over 200 pogroms in Russia just between 1881 and 1884.
Yeah, that's mind-boggling. I mean, when you hear that number, it just really hits you, like how widespread and how systematic this violence was.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at the sources, like what were the, some of the main drivers behind this kind of relentless persecution?
Well, a lot of it seems to stem from like broader social and economic trends, like times of upheaval, uncertainty. You see this pattern of like minority groups being scapegoated and, Jewish communities were often seen as like distinct, different. They became easy targets for people's frustrations and anger.
Right, right. Like during the Black Death in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
The plague was devastating Europe and people were looking for someone to blame.
And they blamed the Jews.
Yeah, and they accused them of like poisoning the wells and all these, crazy things. And then you see this happening again in the 19th century with like the rapid industrialization.
Yeah.
Economic changes,
Yes.
people losing their jobs. And again, they look for a scapegoat.
It's that classic, like, things are going bad, let's find someone to blame. And the Jews were like a convenient target.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about economic anxieties either.
Yeah.
There was also this underlying current of religious prejudice, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it.
This idea of Jews as being like outsiders, alien. No matter how long they'd lived in a particular place, there was always this sense of like them not really belonging.
And that like feeds into this, dangerous narrative of like us versus them, and it creates this climate where violence becomes acceptable, even like justified in some people's minds.
Right. And it's really sobering to see how often attempts to protect Jewish communities ultimately failed. Even when you had like high-ranking officials speaking out against the violence, It often wasn't enough to stop it. Like even Pope Clement VI during the Black Death,
Yeah.
he issued these pronouncements, trying to counter the accusations against the Jews.
Right.
But the mob mentality was just too strong.
Yeah, it's like the authorities, even when they had good intentions, they just didn't have the power or the will to really protect these communities. And that just underscores how vulnerable they were, like at the mercy of these forces that were often beyond their control.
Right. And I think, one of the things that really brings home the brutality of this is the Kishinev pogrom in 1903.
Oh, yeah, that was horrific.
Over 100 Jews were killed.
And I was reading this account in the New York Times from back then, and
Yeah.
I mean, the details are just horrifying. Like, they were literally, like, clubbing people to death,
Yeah.
mutilating bodies, and this wasn't just, like, a few, like, rogue individuals. This was, like, a mob of thousands of people.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to, not just look at the statistics, but to actually try to grasp the human cost of this violence. The sheer terror that these communities lived with.
Exactly. And, it's one thing to read about these events in a history book. It's another to try to imagine yourself in that situation, like living with that constant fear, knowing that at any moment, your home, your family could be attacked. I mean, how do you even begin to process that kind of trauma?
Yeah, it's against this backdrop of, relentless violence
Yeah.
that Zionism emerges as one response. And it's important to note that it wasn't the only response.
Right.
There were other Jewish movements at the time, like socialism, anarchism.
Yeah, a lot of Jewish people at the time, they were drawn to these like universalist movements. They wanted to see like a fundamental restructuring of society to end all oppression, not just for Jews, but for everyone.
Right.
And they thought that, through social change or political reform, they could create a world where everyone was treated equally.
Right. But Zionism offered a different path. Right.
Yeah, it was about like Jewish self-determination.
Right.
It said, we need our own sovereign homeland, a place where we can be safe, where we can control our own destiny. And for those who had experienced this, relentless persecution in Europe, this idea was incredibly appealing.
Right. And you see this really reflected in like the Billu Group's manifesto from 1882.
Yeah.
It's this passionate plea to like abandon the false dream of assimilation.
Right.
And return to Zion. And the language itself is really powerful. It talks about, like the Jewish people, like awakening from this long slumber and, like shaking off the dust of exile and like reclaiming their rightful place in the world.
Yeah, it really captures the sense of like longing, this desire for a place where they could finally be free.
Right. And then, of course, you have Theodor Herzl and his 1896 pamphlet, The Jewish State.
Yeah, Herzl is considered like the father of modern Zionism. And his argument was basically this: anti-Semitism isn't going away. He said it's not just a temporary problem that can be solved through integration or assimilation. It's like baked into European society.
Yeah.
He actually said that, persecution arises wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers.
Wow.
And, he had this experience with the Dreyfus affair in France,
Right.
which really disillusioned him because, France was supposed to be this like enlightened republic, right?
Right.
But even there, a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason just because he was Jewish. And Herzl saw this as like proof that, even in the most supposedly tolerant societies, Jews would never be truly accepted.
Right. So for him, the only solution was a separate Jewish state, a place where Jews can finally be in control of their own destiny.
Exactly. And that idea resonated deeply with a lot of Jews who had experienced this persistent anti-Semitism. But it's important to remember that there wasn't universal agreement within the Jewish community about Zionism.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, a lot of Jews, particularly in Western Europe, they felt very much at home in their countries, and they were skeptical of this whole idea.
Yeah, they saw Zionism as maybe even like a threat to their integration.
Right.
Like it was feeding into this anti-Semitic trope that Jews had dual loyalties, that they weren't really loyal to the countries where they lived.
Right. And if we look at Britain, for example, by 1913, Zionist participation was relatively low.
Yeah, I mean, there were some prominent figures within the Anglo-Jewish community who were actually like actively opposed to Zionism. They argued that it played into the hands of anti-Semites.
Right. But for Herzl and for other Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann, the continued violence in Europe, and the mass exodus of Jews from places like Russia, this was just like overwhelming evidence that assimilation was not a viable solution for everyone.
Yeah, between 1881 and 1914, like 2.5 million Jews emigrated from Russia. I mean, that's a huge number of people fleeing persecution.
Mm.
And for them, a Jewish homeland wasn't just an idea, it was like a necessity.
It's interesting, though, that when this idea of a Jewish homeland first emerged, Palestine wasn't necessarily like the immediate focus.
Yeah, that's right.
Herzl himself, in the early stages, he seemed to consider Palestine as almost like a neutral territory. And there wasn't a lot of thought given initially to the Arab population that was already living there. So how do we understand that?
Well, I think you have to remember that the early Zionists were primarily focused on the existential threat that they were facing in Europe.
Right.
Their immediate concern was finding a safe haven. And Palestine was seen as one possible location among several others.
Right.
And there was this sense that, the main conflict was with Europe, not with the inhabitants of Palestine.
Right.
And you see this reflected in the Balfour Manifesto. They refer to the Ottoman Turks who ruled Palestine at the time as Brother Ishmael.
Oh, wow.
Which suggests that, they saw them more as like potential allies,
Right.
Against a common enemy, which was European anti-Semitism.
Right. So their perspective was very much shaped by their own experiences of persecution.
Yeah.
And, understandably so, but of course that kind of overlooks the existing population and the potential for conflict down the road.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll see unfold as we go along. As Zionism starts to move from being just an idea to a set of practical actions, and as more Jews start settling in Palestine, the situation becomes much more complex.
Right. Okay, so we have this ideological foundation of Zionism taking shape. But how did it actually move from aspiration to, action?
Well, within the Zionist movement itself, there were different factions with different priorities. You had political Zionism, which was led by Herzl, and they emphasized the need for international recognition, getting the support of major powers.
Right.
And establishing a legal framework for a Jewish state.
Right.
But then you also had practical Zionism, which was focused on like the groundwork.
Okay.
Establishing communities in Palestine, acquiring land, building institutions. And they believed that, by creating facts on the ground, they could eventually force the international community to recognize a Jewish state.
So like two different approaches, but ultimately working towards the same goal.
Yeah, and at the first Zionist Congress in 1897, Herzl privately, he talked about laying the foundation for a Jewish state within 50 years.
Wow.
But publicly, the stated goal was more vague. They talked about creating a home for the Jewish people in Palestine,
Right.
secured by public law. So there was this kind of strategic ambiguity.
I see. So not to like alarm the Ottoman authorities too much.
Exactly. But it's interesting because, even as they were talking about, creating a home for the Jewish people,
Right.
there were also these discussions internally about how to actually obtain the land.
Right.
And some of the language that was used is kind of unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, our sources include some pretty troubling quotes, like talking about how to easily take away the country from the Arabs through stratagems.
Yeah, that's right.
What does that tell us about the thinking at the time?
Well, I think it reveals that, while the public narrative often emphasized peaceful settlement,
Right.
there was also an awareness that acquiring land would likely involve displacement and that they might need to use, less than transparent methods to achieve their goals.
So not always acknowledging the potential for conflict with the existing Arab population.
Yeah. And one of the key instruments in this acquisition process was the Jewish National Fund,
Right.
which was established in 1901. And they basically raised money from Jews all over the world to buy land in Palestine.
Oh, those little blue boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Those iconic blue boxes. People would put their donations in there.
Right.
And that money would be used to purchase land. And a lot of this land was actually purchased from absentee landlords.
Right.
But it still had consequences for the tenant farmers who were living on it.
And then you have the rise of labor Zionism,
Yeah.
which adds like another dimension to this whole thing.
Yeah, labor Zionism was really influenced by socialist ideas.
Right.
And they believed that Jews should not only acquire land, but they should also work the land themselves,
Right.
rather than relying on Arab labor. And this was seen as like a way to build a more egalitarian society and to avoid the kind of exploitative labor practices that were often associated with colonialism.
So like a conscious effort to create a different kind of society.
Yeah, exactly. And they believed that by physically working the land, Jews would not only develop the economy of their future state, but they would also strengthen their own national identity.
Okay, so all these efforts are underway. But what about the Palestinian Arab population? during this early period?
Well, our sources suggest that there wasn't a lot of political organization or engagement at a national level at that time.
Okay.
Literacy rates were also fairly low,
Right.
which meant that they were not as well equipped to mount a unified resistance to Zionist settlement, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't any awareness or opposition.
Right.
There were definitely instances of local resistance.
Right.
And even within Zionism itself, there were voices that warned about the potential for conflict.
Like who?
Like Asher Ginsburg, who wrote under the pen name Ahad Ham. He was one of the early intellectuals who said, the Arab population is not just going to step aside.
Yeah, that's an important point to remember. It wasn't like they were just unaware of what was happening.
Right. But the outbreak of World War I really changes the game.
Yeah, how so?
Well, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine, they sided with Germany
Right.
against Britain and the Allied powers.
Okay.
And this created a huge opportunity for the Zionist movement, because they saw a chance to align their goals with the interests of a major world power.
Right.
And Chaim Weizmann played a critical role in this. He was a brilliant chemist.
Right.
And he had made some important contributions to the British war effort. He had developed a process for producing acetone, which was essential for making explosives. And this gave him access to some really influential figures in the British government, like Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour.
So he was able to leverage his scientific expertise for political gain.
Yeah, exactly. And he was very skillful at navigating the kind of murky world of wartime politics.
Right. And it seems like he even used some of the existing British anxieties and prejudices to his advantage.
Yeah, that's right. There was this widespread fear in Britain at the time about an international Jewish conspiracy,
Right.
which was, of course, a completely baseless anti-Semitic idea.
Right.
But Weizmann kind of tapped into that fear.
Right.
And he suggested that, Jewish support could be a valuable asset for Britain in the war.
Oh, wow.
Particularly in influencing public opinion in the U.S. and Russia.
I see.
So he essentially turned this prejudice into a political bargaining chip.
It's a pretty fascinating example of how political maneuvering works sometimes.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a complex and, morally ambiguous aspect of the story.
Right. But meanwhile, Britain is also making promises to the Arabs.
Right.
Promising them independence if they support the British against the Ottomans.
Exactly.
So you already have this potential for conflicts brewing.
Yeah, and the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement makes things even more complicated.
What was that?
Well, it was a secret deal between Britain and France to divide up the Middle East after the war.
Okay.
And it completely disregarded the aspirations of the Arab population for self-determination.
Oh, wow.
So you have Britain making these conflicting promises to both the Zionists and the Arabs.
And setting the stage for a whole lot of trouble down the line.
Yeah, exactly. And by 1917, Britain is facing some serious challenges in the war.
Right.
The French army is mutinying, Russia's collapsing, and they're desperate for any advantage they can get.
Right.
And Weizmann sees this as an opportunity.
Okay.
He warns Balfour that Germany might offer its support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Oh, wow.
And that really gets their attention.
So they're worried about Germany, getting a leg up.
Exactly. They don't want to lose this potential strategic alliance.
Right.
And so they decide to issue the Balfour Declaration in November 1917.
Which is a huge turning point.
Yeah.
So the Balfour Declaration, it's a relatively short document, but it's had a massive impact. And, the famous line is that it expresses support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. But it also says that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Yeah, and that's where things get really complicated.
Right.
Because there are all these different interpretations and motivations behind the Declaration.
Right. So let's unpack that a little bit. I mean, what did the Declaration actually mean for Weizmann and the Zionist movement?
Well, for them, it was seen as a major step towards achieving their ultimate goal of a Jewish state.
Right.
But Britain's motivations were much more complex and ambiguous.
Okay, how so?
Well, some key figures in the British government, like Balfour himself and Lloyd George, they were actually driven by Christian Zionist beliefs.
Interesting.
They saw a Jewish return to Palestine as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Oh, wow.
Others saw it more through a strategic lens. They wanted to secure British influence in the Middle East, particularly near the Suez Canal, which was strategically vital.
Right.
And they thought that, having a Jewish presence in Palestine could help them achieve that goal.
Right.
And there was also this hope that they could gain the support of Jewish communities around the world, especially in the U.S., which was becoming increasingly important.
Okay, so a mix of religious, geopolitical, and even like domestic political considerations.
Exactly. But the way the Declaration was publicly interpreted was often much simpler.
Right.
It was basically seen as saying Palestine for the Jews.
Oh, wow.
And that created a huge sense of injustice among the Arab
Yeah, I
population.
can imagine. I mean, they had been led to believe that they would gain independence after the war.
Exactly. They had supported the British against the Ottomans.
Right.
And now it seemed like a major world power was just endorsing the creation of a Jewish national home in their land.
Without their consent.
Yeah. And Hussein bin Ali, who was the leader of the Arab revolt, he raised some serious concerns.
Right.
He sent letters to the British government pointing out the contradiction between their promises to the Arabs and their support for Zionism.
Right.
And even T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia,
Oh, wow.
he later wrote about how he felt a sense of guilt over the way the Arabs had been treated.
Wow. So there was a recognition even among some of the British officials that this was a betrayal.
Yeah, definitely.
But there was this attempt, wasn't there, at finding common ground? I
Yeah.
mean, there was that meeting between Weizmann and Herzl in 1918.
Yeah, that's right.
What happened there?
Well, Weizmann went to meet Herzl in Aqaba,
Okay.
and he tried to reassure him that Zionism wasn't about displacing the Arabs.
Right.
He said, we just want to create a home for the Jewish people,
Okay.
and we believe that we can coexist peacefully. And he pointed to the long history of Jews and Arabs living together in the region.
Right.
And Herzl, he was initially open to cooperation.
Right.
He saw potential benefits in Jewish economic development for the region.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem was that you had these conflicting promises from the British.
Right.
And both sides felt like they had a legitimate claim to the same territory.
Right.
And this tension really came to a head at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919,
Right.
where the future of the Middle East was being negotiated.
So even though the Jewish population in Palestine was still relatively small at that time,
Yeah, only about 8%.
the stage was already set for conflict.
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration, it really created this situation where you had these competing national aspirations
Right.
that were going to be incredibly difficult to reconcile.
And it formalized the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine.
Exactly. And that had a profound impact on the future of both the Jewish and the Arab populations.
All right, so let's take a step back and just recap what we've learned today in our deep dive. We started by looking at the centuries of anti-Jewish violence in Europe and Russia, and how that created this sense of urgency, this need for a safe haven for the Jewish people, which fueled the rise of the Zionist movement. And we talked about the different strategies and motivations of the early Zionists.
Yeah.
Some were focused on political recognition. Others were more focused on building communities on the ground.
Right.
And we explored the complex and often contradictory role of Britain in this whole story, making promises to both the Zionists and the Arabs.
Yeah. And ultimately issuing the Balfour Declaration, which really changed the course of history.
Exactly. And the Balfour Declaration, while it was, carefully worded,
Right.
it created this foundation for the ongoing conflict.
Yeah.
Because it ignited this political struggle over the land.
Right.
And it raised these fundamental questions about, who has the right to self-determination?
Exactly.
And how do you reconcile competing claims to the same territory?
And those questions are still with us today.
Right. And as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. We've seen how specific historical decisions made in specific contexts can have these really long-lasting and far-reaching consequences. So I want you to think about how the legacy of these decisions and the promises that were made and broken continue to shape the Middle East today, and how understanding this history can help us to better grasp the complexities of the region.
Yeah, it's not about laying blame or anything. It's about understanding how we got here.
Exactly.
And hopefully that understanding can help us to move forward in a more constructive way.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into such a pivotal period in history. We hope you found it illuminating, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues on your own.
Yeah, thanks for listening.